Hello and welcome back. Going to have a look at map objects for Seasons 19. Specifically in this particular video I want to look at ice planes. I have done a video on this in the past for Season 17, but I wanted to do a bit of an update video because I want to have a bit of an experiment, one in Blender, to see if I can actually make something a little bit better than just a simple flat plane, and two, the actual user attributes have changed slightly. I think it was SS ice plane before. I have done a video, as you can see here, the 17, like I say, but some things have changed, and I've learned a little bit more about Blender in the time period between the two versions of Seasons. So I'll just have a bit of a play and see if I can make something a little bit more interesting than just a simple flat plane. There are some, or there is some information here about collisions and collision masks and how to set them up correctly so that if you're not playing Seasons, you don't have this invisible collision over your lake or pond or whatever else. But we'll come back to all of this stuff later on. So if you're not sure where this is, just go to the Realismus modding site and then just go into mods, more info, and then manual, and then come down to here and you've got map objects, and this is where we'll be working, but or taking the information from. So I'm going to use Blender 2.79 because we don't have an i3D exporter for 2.8, even though that is now in full release. I'm sure Giants are on the case, or I hope they are anyway. It would be nice to use the later version of Blender, but at the moment I'll stick with 2.79, that's fine. So when you first open up Blender, if you've not used it before or you're not familiar with it, you might end up with a default cube, so it will look something like this when you first start Blender. I've actually deactivated the default cube in the preferences, but if you do have this, literally just press A on your keyboard to select everything in the scene here, and then we're going to go X and delete and just get rid of everything. I want to take this sidebar away with the T key and this one with the N key, and just have, it gives me a bit more viewport to work with so I can see what's going on a little bit easier. I'm going to then go Shift A, Mesh, Plane, and bring in a plane, a flat plane. Now this is going to be way too small because at the moment this is only 2 meters in size, so it's going to be really, really small. And if I then apply a texture to this and then export it out, put it in GiantSerter and try and scale it up, it's going to really mess up my texture. It's going to distort it all to hell. So we want to get a good sized plane to work with that would cover most areas of small ponds and small lakes and things like that. But you might need to have a look at the map that you're going to be applying it to and get a rough idea of the sort of size that you want the plane to be. So minimal scaling is required once you actually get it into GiantSerter. So what I'm going to do here, if I go N and bring up my sidebar here, in the dimensions I'm going to type in there 100 and 100 on the X and Y, and by doing that you can see it's increased my scaling. So what I want to do is apply the scaling now, so it puts it all back to 1, 1 and 1. So I'm going to go Control A and go to Scale, and that will put that all back to 1, 1 and 1. If we don't do that in here, again, this can cause some issues with our texture, and it is recommended to have the scaling at 1, 1 and 1 when we do our unwrap, because it can cause some issues with how the texture is applied to the actual mesh. So it's always a good idea to do that. So talking about unwraps, what we'll do is go Tab on the keyboard, U, to go into our UV mapping and go unwrap. This is just a simple flat plane, so a simple unwrap is more than adequate. I don't need to do anything else there. And if I actually open up another window here and then switch over to UV image editor, you can see that's my simple unwrap, nothing too fancy. So we'll just right click on the center here. So if you get the 2 arrows where you can actually move the windows, right click and then go join area and drag either way. I want to close this one down, the window on the right, so I drag to the right, left click, and it goes away. Now I have switched around some of my key bindings. My mouse keys are switched, so I actually select with my left mouse button, not my right mouse button. So by default in 2.79 you actually select your object with your right mouse button, but I've switched all my keys around and adjusted some of my key bindings and things like that. Most of the things would be done with the middle mouse key, but I've actually bound it to one of my bumper keys, my thumb bumper keys. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about what buttons I've pressed because they won't relate to what you will be pressing, because I've remapped a lot of the key bindings to suit my preferences. So what we'll do then is, because I'm going to have a bit of a play around here and kind of give this a little bit more geometry so it actually has some humps and bumps in it, and proper ones, not fake ones generated by a normal map, I'm going to need to give this a little bit more geometry to work with, because if I want to actually manipulate this somewhat, I've only got one face to work with, so it's not really going to allow me to do a lot. So what I want to do here is actually subdivide this. So I'm going to press the W key on my keyboard and then go to subdivide, and you can see it's subdivided that face. If I then press the T key to open up this sidebar, we've got how many number of cuts I want to apply to this. So in here I'm actually going to type in 30, which will be more than enough. Now this is going to increase my triangle count quite considerably by the time I've finished, so you might not want to go that many. You might only want to go maybe 10 or 20, but the more cuts you put in there, the more it gives you, more geometry you've got to work with to manipulate the actual mesh to give you a better result, or perhaps maybe a more desired result, whatever. But I'm going to go 30. If you want to experiment with that, start at 10 and then see how it looks and go upwards from there. But I wouldn't go above 30 because, like I say, it will increase your triangle count. As you can see up here, I'm already over almost 2,000 actually. So, I have to be a bit careful with that. But Farming Simulator 19 is more forgiving with the update to the graphics engine and things like that. But if you're on a slightly lesser spec machine, you might not want to go this many subdivides or cuts, or just stick with a flat plane. But this is what I'm going to do anyway. So now that I've got a bit more geometry there, I'm going to tab back into object mode. And if you don't want to use the tab on your keyboard, you can always switch between edit mode and object mode down here. So in object mode, what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a modifier. So I'm going to come over to the modifiers tab here, add a modifier, and I'm going to use displace. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a texture map to displace my mesh. So on the right hand side here, to the right of the new button, it says here show texture in texture tab. If I click that, it will then automatically take me to the texture tab. If I go new, make sure you're on image or movie, and I'm going to go open. If I go to my desktop, I've got my frozen lake diffuse texture. So if I double click on that, you can already see it started to manipulate the mesh. Because I've applied all of those different cuts, it's giving it more geometry to then displace. But this texture has a lot of color in it, and the more color, the less effect it will give you. So what we want to do here is go drop down the colors box here and reduce the saturation down to 0 to make this a more grayscale, which would represent a displacement or height map. And that will then work with the geometry a little bit better to give you better results. So what we'll do is go back to the modifiers tab. Depending on how mad you want to go with this, I wouldn't recommend to go really mad, but you can have a bit of a play around with the strength. But first of all, what I'm going to do, because everything works on a UV, most game engines do, an unwrap of your actual mesh, we're going to change the texture coordinates from local to UV. And I'm going to select my UV map, which I created by doing the unwrap. And as you can see, that's kind of changed how the geometry works a little bit now and how it's manipulated the mesh. So what we're going to do then is just increase the scaling or the strength slightly. So again, you can play around with this. You might maybe go 1.5, maybe put it up to 2, something like that. But if you start to drag a lot, you'll get something like this, which will just be far too much. That'll be out of control. So I would probably say in this particular case, 2 is more than enough, because all I want to do is just give it a little bit extra so that when I drive on it, it's not going to just be literally a flat plane. It will actually cause me to hump and bump over, the rough terrain or the rough icy kind of effect, if you like, of the lake. At least that's the plan anyway. We'll see how that works. So what I might also do here now is if I press T to open my sidebar, I'll press the smooth shading. And that will reduce it somewhat, but it will give it, as it says, a more smoothing shading. So it will take a lot of the rough edges away and then give it a bit of a better sort of look. And when you drive on it now, it will look and feel a little bit better, I think. You could perhaps maybe go a little bit further. So if I apply this displacement modifier and I then go to add new modifier and I go to bevel, it will then bevel the edges, so it will sort of round off all of the sharp edges and give it a little bit more geometry again. But this will also increase your triangle count, so only use that if you really want to or have to, because like I say, I'm up to now, yeah, I'm still just shy of 2,000 triangles. So if I start to add the bevel modifier, that will probably increase dramatically. So in this particular case, I'm not going to, because like I say, I just want to give it a little bit more than it being a flat plane, just a few humps and bumps here, so it actually feels like I'm driving over ice, you know, a frozen lake sort of thing. And then what we'll do from there then is we'll apply our material. So we'll go into the materials tab here. If you just hover your cursor over it, will say material. If you're not sure, just, you know, so that's the modifiers. This is your material. So we're going to apply a new material, and I'm going to just click in here and change this to ice_matte. And then I'm going to go to my textures. I'm going to go new, and if we scroll down, we'll minimize that now because I don't need that anymore. We'll go open, back on my desktop, and we'll then bring in the frozen lake diffuse texture. At the moment you can't see any texture on here because I'm in solid shade mode, but if I were to go Shift A and bring in a lamp, we'll bring in a sun, and I'll just raise that up a little bit like so. And then I switch over to material shading, you can see we can now see our texture, and it's got a little bit of, you know, the humps and bumps in it and whatever else. And like I say, you might need to experiment with that a little bit, but if we look across here, you can see it's got some dips in it and some humps and bumps and whatever else. And I think that just adds to the effect of the frozen lake. It's just not going to be a simple, flat, boring plane. But again, like I say, it's entirely up to you which way you want to go with that. So now that we've got all that set up, that's pretty much it in Blender. We don't really need to do much else there. So what we're going to do then is, if I delete the lamp, because we don't want to export that out with into our i3D, we'll go back to solid shade mode. Now what I tend to do here, if I'm just working with one material and one texture, then I actually remove the texture, because I'm working with a PNG. When I export this out as an i3D and then open up the i3D in Giant Editor, it's going to scream at me and tell me I'm working with a raw image file because it's a PNG, and I would then have to go through the process of converting it into a DDS and so on and so on. So I may as well just delete it from here and just add it into Giant Editor that way, and it'll work a lot better for me in that sense. But if I was working with multiple materials, I would then export with the textures, because I have found sometimes in 2.79, and I don't know if that's Blender or the i3D exporter that's doing it, but if I have multiple materials with no textures applied to them, when I export it out as an i3D, all of the materials become combined, and then you can't actually switch textures in Giant Editor because they all share the same material. So you change the texture on one material, the whole thing changes. So that gets a bit more complicated, but in this particular case, I can just get rid of this texture here and then reapply it once I get it into Giant Editor. So up to you though, you could export it with the texture and then just change it later on. It's not a big deal. So what I'm going to do then is just go File, Export, Giant Size 3D. I'm going to go to my desktop and we'll just call this Ice Plane. Something like that, that'll do, and then hit enter and it will put the extension on the end i3D, and we'll export. So if I minimize that down for now, we have our i3D. So I'm going to open this up in the Giant Editor, and you can see we have our ice plane, and you can see there straight away it's got all these humps and bumps in it. It shows up really well when it's like this, and I think that looks much better than having just a simple flat plane. and it will be a little bit different. You know, when you drive on it, you'll notice the humps and bumps, and it will just, again, in my opinion, feel like you're actually driving over a frozen lake and not just a flat, boring plane. So we do get a warning which says i3D contains non-binary index triangle sets. So I like to get rid of that warning straight away. So what I'm going to do is File, Save As. I'll go to my desktop, select my iceplane i3D, and then Save As type, I'm going to select binary i3D files. I'm going to click Save. It asks if I want to replace it. Yes. And I'm going to close it down. Because I moved the camera around and did some things there, it asks me if I want to save it again. I'm going to click no, because if I click yes, it will undo what I've just created here and delete my shapes file, or it won't even create it. So if you do move the camera around after saving it as a binary file and it asks you to save it again, click no. Otherwise it will revert back to what it was before and you'll have to go through the process all over again. So we'll open it back up again in GiantS Editor. And no more warning. Fantastic. So if I now select my plane with the material editing window open, if this is an open window, material editing, and it will pop up, it might be over here, it might be over here, it can be anywhere, it might be up there, wherever. So locate it where it is for you. And then what we're going to do is add in our albedo map, which is also our diffuse. As I said before, I'm working with a PNG file, but by adding the texture in through GiantS Editor, what it will do is automatically convert it for me to a DDS. So if I double click on here, it's going to give me a warning. It'll say convert texture. There is no optimized version of the selected texture available. Convert now. Yes. And this will then convert that PNG into a DDS file for me, meaning I don't have to go through the motions of trying to figure out what format I need to have it saved in, or whether it's got MIP maps or whatever else. It will do everything for me. So that's really, really nice. So if I close that down, you can now see the texture's been applied, but it's still really, really shiny at the moment. So a couple of things you could do. You could change the smoothness and mattleness down to 0, but I always just like to apply a gloss map, and I'm going to use a default one which is supplied by GiantS in the Farming Simulator installation folder. So for me, it's on my D drive under Games, Farming Simulator 2019. It's probably in a different place for you, especially if you're on Steam. So locate where your Farming Simulator 2019 installation is, and then we're going to go Data, Shared, and in here we have a default specular. So I'm going to just double click on that, and now it's not all shiny anymore, it's just nice. And if I go Control L to bring in a lamp, we now have our nice textured plane, but it's got all the ridges and bumps and humps and whatever else in it, which I think looks much, much better. We can either go one step further here and add in a normal map. So we'll just again go to the Farming Simulator installation folder, Data, Shared, and then we have a default normal, which we can also apply. Not required, but I always, again, as I say, like to do that. And there we go. So now we've got our plane all set up and everything else. It's a case of adding in the appropriate user attributes. So I'm going to close the material editing window down. I'm going to go user attributes. Again, this can be anywhere. It might be over to the left, to the right, under here, wherever. Locate where it is for you. We're going to click on the plane again. If I go back to the Realismus modding site, and we'll come down to the bottom for frozen lakes, and we have this class name mod on create.iceplane, which we need to add in. But if we actually look up here, it says that Admiras are object classes with an onCreate method, and you have probably seen the term onCreate before. This was, you know, something that was used heavily for the Fabric script and M Company script and things like that. They all had the onCreate in the user attributes. So if you've come across that before, that's what it's saying. It's quite a commonly used class. So we need to set up our onCreate for the user attribute first, and then we add in this information here. So I'm going to take a copy of that, Control C, we'll go back into GiantS Editor, and then for our new attribute name, I'm just going to go on create, and it needs to be spelt like that with the uppercase C. From the drop down, we're going to go script callback, because this is basically calling or looking for a script. So it's going to call back and say I'm looking for this particular script, which we're going to paste in here, the ice plane setup. So we'll hit tab and lock in that change. And then we also need to go back to here again, because as I said before about collisions, it then says attributes collision mask, which is an integer, and it's a default of the actual object's collision mask. And when I first read that, I thought, okay, so we just add a collision to the object and it defaults to whatever it is, and that's good enough. But it actually means a bit more than that, because if we look back up here, if you have a player that is, for whatever reason, chooses not to use seasons, if we make the object collidable, so that when it appears at the appropriate time of the year, temperature, or whatever else, it is collidable and we can then drive on it and whatever else, potentially, if you're not playing seasons, that's going to be an invisible object with a collision mask on it. So, and it's going to cover your lake, pond, whatever else. So you won't be able to get access to the water. And if it's set up as a proper water plane, where you can actually put your drown your vehicles and also get free water from, you won't be able to do that, because there'll be this frozen collision above the water, above your water plane. So we need to do it a little bit differently to what we did in 17 by actually setting up some different attributes and then telling the game that we are setting this as a rigid body, but we're actually removing the collision mask from that object. So in other words, it's not collidable. But then we're also going to add another attribute in, which is going to tell seasons when the mod is running and the actual object becomes visible to apply that collision. So what we're going to do then is, back into GiantSerter, first of all, I'm going to make the object rigid body. So I'll click in the rigid body box here. While I'm here, I'm also going to reduce the clip distance down to about 350. Now if we go to the rigid body tab, we have this collision mask. And what it's saying in the instructions here is we need to make that 0. So we need to set the actual collision mask for the object in the attributes to 0. And we do that by opening up the little box here. And at the moment we've got this information. If I clear it, it goes to 0, which is what it's saying in the instructions. And we click OK. Now that object has no collision, so you could pass straight through it. That's basically what we're trying to achieve. But we still need to have the ability for seasons to apply a collision to it when the ice plane appears. Otherwise it's just going to be a pretty looking ice plane that we can still drive through and access our water, which is not really the whole idea of it. So we want to have it collidable at the appropriate time when it becomes visible. And we do that by adding in another attribute here, this collision mask attribute. So what I'm going to do is change or make a copy of that, go back into GiantSerter, and we're going to add that into there. And as it says in the instructions, this needs to be an integer. So from the drop down, we select integer, and an integer is basically a whole number. So it can't have a decimal, it has to be a whole number. So we then add in, we press add to create that new collision mask. And it's saying here, it gives us a couple of examples. So 255, which is the decimal of the collision mask. We go back into GiantSerter. If I open up the box here again for the collision mask, and if I select at 0 to 7, which is what the default is, FF, our bit mask in decimal is 255, which is what the instructions are saying here. So that's the number that gets entered into here. So we can make a copy of that. I'll cancel that to keep it at 0 on the actual object itself, but in our user attribute, we'll put the 255. So now when this script callback runs, it will then make the plane visible and apply the collision mask. So it becomes collidable, but for the rest of the year, it won't be collidable. And for anybody who plays without seasons, it won't be collidable. So the final thing that what we need to do though is actually make this invisible, because it's all right having it set with no collision, but it's still going to be visible. So anybody playing the game without seasons will have this over their water plane all the year round. So we need to make this invisible. So what we do here we'll reselect it again. In the transform tab, we just, in the visibility, we take the tick away out the box and it becomes invisible. And then the actual seasons scripting will make it visible and apply the collision mask. But for everybody else not playing seasons, it will just be invisible all the time with no collision. Hopefully all that makes sense. There's a little bit to get your head around, but if you just follow what I've shown you there and how the instructions are set up here and whatever else, just follow through those, read through these, you should be able to get a handle on it. So now that we've got all of that set up, we've got our user attributes and we've set it to have no collision on it or no collision mask and whatever else. The final thing what I probably would do here is under shape, I don't particularly want the ice plane to cast a shadow, but I would like it to receive shadows, because if it's on a pond where there's trees and things like that around it, I would actually like the trees to cast a shadow over my ice lake or my frozen lake, if that makes sense. So I'm going to select the receive shadow map, but as far as it goes with cast shadow map, I'm going to leave that unticked. But again, that's entirely up to you which way you want to go with that. So now that we've got all of this set up, I'm going to go ahead and save. I will delete the light because that will mess things right up if I leave that in there. And I'll go ahead and save again, and we'll close this down. So I've now got my DDS file, which was created by the Giant Serter, because there's my PNG up there. So finally what I'm going to do, before I actually add it to the map, and this is just something I like to do, is change the PNG to DDS. Not required, but I prefer to have it that way. And we'll go ahead and click save and close that down. So then what I want to do is add all of this to the map itself. And I have a sample mod map of Felsbrunn. So for me, what I would do here, if you plan on adding in lots of different seasons objects, snowmen, barbecues, ice cream carts, whatever you want to do, it might be better to actually create a folder in here with all of those different textures in. Perhaps maybe, for any additional objects that you're going to be adding into your mod map, then you would probably want a separate textures folder anyway. So we're going to create that, and then what I'll do is I'll take my DDS file for the frozen lake and put into there. If I then go back to the maps folder, I'm going to take my i3D shapes, Control X to cut it, and then we'll just paste those into here like so. And because I've moved where the texture is, I'm going to need to change the file name so it can locate it. So we'll open this up again in Notepad++, and I'm just going to type in there textures with the /, and we'll go ahead and save again. Now when I open this up, I'm going to open it up separately in its own i3D just to make sure it has no errors. Fantastic. And if you want to just check it, you can turn the visibility back on and we can see it all working. Fantastic. So we'll just close that down, don't need to save it. So if we now go into the actual map, and before I do that, I'm actually going to close down Blender because I'm happy with the way it's turned out. So I don't really need to do much more there. So we'll open up the map, the sample mod map of Felsbrunn in the Giant Serter. And then we'll just apply the actual ice plane, and I'm going to put it on this particular pond here. I'm not sure if there are others on this particular map. I think that might be the only one. I can't remember. Pretty sure it is though, but anyway, whatever. So we're going to apply our ice plane over this particular pond. Again, like I generally do with a lot of different things when I add into a map, I like to have it in its own transform group. Just keeps everything nice and tidy. And if you're again going to add in lots of different seasonal objects like snowmen, barbecue, etc., you might want to have them all in their own separate transform groups. So I'm going to actually create a new transform group, and then what I'll do here is I'll just call this seasons objects, and then I'll go file, import, and we'll go into where I've got the actual folder for the sample mod map in my documents mods folder. So we'll go maps and then ice plane i3D, and we'll go Control B, interactive placement, and click. I obviously want to make it visible so I can actually see it for positioning in it and everything else. So we're just going to get this somewhere in the right position here. to cover my waterplane. And as you can see, where I scaled it up in Blender to 100 by 100, this is going to cover this area quite nicely, I think. So we'll just make it a little bit bigger that way. If I deselect it, we now have an ice plane over our water plane. I don't think that looks too bad. And theoretically, what I would be trying to achieve here is when the snow actually comes in, because of the way masks, whether it be a tip coal, seasons mask, or whatever else is painted onto the map, it's painted in like squares, and it's very difficult to actually get right up to the edges. You know, when you're actually painting your seasons mask in, that you don't want the snow in the actual to show up in the pond, and you're trying to paint around the edge of the pond and then fill in the pond with your seasons mask, it can be difficult to get the edges right, because what you'll end up with is gaps where there'll be no snow. So what I'd like to be able to do is have it where the ice plane actually comes up and meets where the snow is actually formed, so that it closes off any gaps around the edge of the pond here. But it's not overly important. That's just a personal preference thing. You might perhaps maybe want to watch for trees and things like that. Because this has got a displacement modifier on it, it's kind of raised it up a little bit. Where I've scaled it out, it's actually going to touch the trees and other different parts of you know, foliage and whatever else. But again, you know, you can have a play around with that. You might need to scale it down a little bit to make it fit a bit better in this area if you're going to use this particular map. So what are we on? X, so I might maybe scale it down just a little bit, so we can go maybe something like that. What have we got here? I want to fit it in the area still, so I might go 221 and just see how that fits in. Still a bit too much on that edge, and maybe a bit on that edge. So we'll go 220. It might be moving it in the wrong places, that's the problem. So let's zoom out a bit and just see how it's looking. Yeah, it's moved it over that way a bit too much. But that's okay. What we'll do then is, you have to be a bit careful with the actual water plane, because we don't want the water plane to be showing through over the ice, because at the end of the day we're trying to represent that the ice has actually been frozen, so we don't want that poking through. So if I come back this way a little bit, just to fill in the gaps there, that will probably do. Not going to get overly excited about it. Maybe move it in on this one a little bit. Yeah, that'll be okay. At the end of the day, if it bothered me that much, I would move the trees. So, you know, we'll just go with that. That'll be fine. And that's pretty much that. We've now got our ice plane in the map in Giants Editor. So, and the other thing to note is that when you actually do this, if I make this invisible, you'll see here that there's a boat on the water. And the way that I've actually set the plane up and positioned it, when the ice plane is formed, it covers the boat, so you can't see the boat anymore. So the fisherman's grabbed his boat and took it off the water before the ice is frozen. But if you had the plane completely flat, because I've got this displace and it's got some humps and bumps in it, I need it to be slightly higher than it normally would be if it was a flat plane, to clear the water plane completely. So in this particular case, it's actually going to cover the boat over and hide it from sight, so that's a good thing. But if it was a completely flat plane, potentially that might not be the case. Again, it would just depend on how high you raised it up and whatever else. So just be a bit aware of that. When you've got other objects that you want to hide, then you'll need to work with those. You could theoretically, for example, I could select that boat and then apply the same user attributes to this boat as I have the ice plane, so that it disappears. Well, actually not the same user attributes, but I could apply a set of user attributes as far as the instructions go here and have it disappear in winter with this particular script setup. But that's something different I'm going to do in a later video, so we won't get too involved with that. So pretty much now I've got my ice plane all set up. It looks good, I think, and we've now set it to invisible, so if I was playing the map without seasons, it would have no collision, it would be invisible, and if we didn't know it was there, we just wouldn't know it was there. You know what I'm saying? It's like, only when you start to run seasons and it appears, you go, oh, there's an ice plane there. So yeah, I think we're pretty good there. So what we'll do then, I've got a save game set up, which I've fast forwarded time to pretty much just before winter. So what I'm going to do is we'll save the map here, and then I'll get into game and we'll fast forward time just a little bit until we get to the correct temperature, and hopefully the ice plane will appear. Now, as far as I'm to my understanding, we'll actually delete those because we don't need them anymore. To my understanding, seasons has a random nature to it, so even though you're in winter, the temperature may not drop enough for it to actually freeze over, and then it won't actually show the ice plane, or it could actually get cold enough in another season for the ice plane to appear without even any snow on the ground. So there will be a somewhat random element to it when the ice plane will actually appear. Again, to my understanding, I could be wrong with that, but I seem to remember in 17 that was the way it was, so I would imagine it's a very similar setup in 19. So what we'll do then is we'll get into game then real quick, and we'll just test that out, and we'll see if I've got it all right and working. Okay, so if I come round to my save game here, we'll just go in here. I've got fast forward mod, the map, and seasons mod. Okay, so just to show you, if I run over to the lake here, there's our lake, and I can swim on the top of the water. If I get out of there and I go into the store here, we'll just buy a pickup. And if I then go over to the store here and get in the pickup, you will see, turn that off, when I go into the actual lake here, I can still drown my vehicles because I've removed the collision mask from the lake, and it's invisible. So like I said before, if I didn't know that there was one there, I would never know there was one there, because unless I was running seasons, it would work exactly the same way as it would on any default map, without anything related to seasons at all. So we'll just reset the truck. And then what we'll do is we'll fast forward time again a little bit. I don't know what the weather is actually set for, what we've got here. So we're looking at couple of days by the looks of things, because Wednesday with Thursday before it gets down to the temperature. So we've got a couple of days, I think, but I didn't want to go too far with the fast forward and skip past the right temperatures and then just have it there when I came into the save game. So I'm just going to fast forward and we'll just see where we end up here. So we're in late autumn and we're getting around the time now. It's still water at the moment. What I don't want to do is actually have the ice plane form around me and then I get stuck in the collision. Okay, so winter has fallen. Fantastic. We're still quite warm at the moment, 6 degrees. So we're just going to go around again. We're dropping temperature quite quick though. 1 degree. It might actually, the frozen lake might appear before it gets round to daytime. I don't know. Let's see how that works. We're, what's that? -2, 1 degree. It may even warm up again before it happens. So today, yeah, it's actually going to get warmer again through this day. And it won't be till Thursday, late Thursday, or what's that, Thursday, well, actually Thursday morning, it's going to start to freeze there, and it warms up again, and it won't be till over here. So, like I said before, seasons is very random. Just because you're in winter doesn't necessarily mean that it will get cold enough to actually achieve the goal that you're trying to get when you're recording a video and get the ice plane to appear. But we'll see. Hopefully it will do. Now I've actually got this set to 3-day seasons because I needed to fast forward. There we go. Fast forward through time quickly, and we have our ice plane. So I'll just get through time a bit so it's a bit brighter in the day. Hopefully it won't disappear on me again. Don't think we're forecasted for snow, but we may be. There we go. That should be enough. So we've actually got our ice plane with its collision. I'm running on the top of it. And if I go back to my truck here, when I now drive onto the ice, I will actually be able to drive on the top of the ice and not disappear into the lake. Like so. If I speed up time a bit slower, and as you can see where I've set it up, it's actually got some proper humps and bumps in it and whatever else. It's just, you know, it's not just a flat boring plane, and in my opinion that is way better. And I'm running at 60 FPS, no problem. A couple of fluctuations to be expected because I'm running seasons and it's doing a lot of calculations, but otherwise, you know, I'm not getting any massive frame drops or lag or whatever else, and the fact that I'm recording as well, so you know, I don't think it's doing too bad. What are we up to? 10 o'clock. That'll do. So there we go. We now have an ice plane on the map. Don't have any snow. I could add some in, I guess. RM add snow. Let's do that and get a bit of snow in here just so we can see what it looks like with the snow. That might do for my screenshot then, maybe. And there we go. So we do have now our ice plane, and I'll just do a screenshot. Ice plane with snow and everything else. It has a collision on it. Don't know, that might be a better screenshot. Let's do that one as well. So yeah, there we go. Don't know really what else I can show you. We'll look at other map objects because we have like all of these reeds and things that are poking up through the ice, which potentially don't really look that good in my opinion because the lake's frozen over. Stuff like this potentially would be dead, or buried under the ice or whatever else. So we'll look at things where we can actually make these disappear at certain times of the year, or potentially if there's snow on the ground. But as you could see here, the ice plane appeared even though I had no snow on the ground. So when you set all these different user attributes up and things like that, you have to take into consideration that snow may fall and you'll get no ice plane, or you'll get an ice plane and no snow. So you have to work with the different user attributes, the different admirers, to achieve the goal that you want. And perhaps maybe like the reeds and that, I would set them up to just literally disappear in winter, irregardless of what else occurred. And that would then suit all purposes. You know, if I ended up with ice, the reeds would not be there, irregardless of whether I had snow or not, and so on and so on. But yeah, there we go. I'm ShyWizard. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.